The story begins in whispers, in shadows cast by centuries-old stone walls, in the quiet corners of history where secrets hide. Across the tapestry of human memory, one figure has always lingered at the edge of legend and history: Mary Magdalene. She was a woman remembered, misunderstood, and in many ways misrepresented. To the faithful, she was the penitent, the devoted follower of Jesus, a witness to the most profound moments of early Christianity. To the historians, she is often a footnote, a name briefly mentioned in texts carefully curated and canonized by those who would dictate the story of faith for generations. But what if the truth of Mary Magdalene extends far beyond the confines of Scripture? What if her legacy, her life, and perhaps even her very bloodline were never meant to be forgotten, only carefully hidden? From the rolling hills of Galilee to the sun-drenched lands of southern France, the trail of Mary Magdalene winds through history like a hidden river beneath the surface of known events. It is a river that scholars, theologians, and mystics alike have attempted to trace, but few have seen its full course. This is a story that straddles the line between fact and legend, history and conspiracy, myth and reality. It is the story of a secret preserved across centuries, carried not only in memory, but in the blood of those who may have descended from her. And yet, for most of the world, this story has remained untold, obscured behind layers of dogma, political power, and deliberate suppression. Imagine, for a moment, the early Christian world, alive with fervor, danger, and secrecy. Jesus of Nazareth moves among the people, preaching, teaching, challenging the authorities. Mary Magdalene walks beside him, not merely as a follower, but perhaps as something more. The Gospels give us glimpses, fleeting and enigmatic, of a woman who was present at the most critical junctures: the crucifixion, the empty tomb, the resurrection. Yet, the texts are carefully selective, offering only fragments of her true role. Scholars have long debated the significance of these omissions. Were they simple oversights or part of a deliberate erasure? What truths might have been too powerful, too dangerous, or too revolutionary to allow into the mainstream narrative? The allure of Mary Magdalene lies not only in her proximity to Jesus, but in what she might have carried forward, a legacy that challenges the foundations of recorded history. The whispers of her bloodline survive in cryptic texts, in stories that medieval monks dared not write openly, in symbols encoded into art and architecture, and in the legends of powerful dynasties across Europe. These are the threads of a hidden tapestry, waiting to be unraveled, each thread leading closer to a secret that could rewrite what we believe about the past. As we embark on this journey, the contrast between what is known and what is hidden becomes stark. On one side, we have the familiar tales of the Church, teachings that have shaped faith and morality for nearly 2 millennia. On the other, a shadowed world of forbidden knowledge, of suppressed histories and mysterious lineages that refuse to die. It is within this tension that our story unfolds, balancing on the knife's edge between revelation and concealment. Somewhere across time and distance, this bloodline may have endured. It may have traversed borders, hidden in plain sight within royal courts, secret societies, and obscure villages. Those who held its secret understood its power, its ability to challenge authority, and perhaps even to redefine the course of history. And this is precisely why it was kept hidden, why it was cloaked in myths, rumors, and coded messages that only the initiated could decipher. Tonight, we will trace that path. We will follow the echoes of Mary Magdalene across centuries, across lands and legends, and into the very heart of Europe's most enigmatic dynasties. We will explore the Grail, not as a vessel of legend alone, but as a symbol of inheritance, lineage, and divine secret. We will uncover the guardians of this hidden bloodline: the Templars, the Merovingians, the mystics and alchemists who protected it at any cost. And as the layers of history peel back, the line between myth and reality will blur, leaving only a haunting question. What if the greatest secret of all time has been hiding in plain sight? In the silence of history, in the shadowed corridors of power, and in the forgotten whispers of sacred texts, Mary Magdalene's story waits. It waits for those willing to look beyond the surface, to question the accepted narratives, and to dare to imagine that history is not always what it seems. And as we step into this hidden world, one truth becomes clear. Some secrets were never meant to be revealed, but they have a way of resurfacing when the time is right. Mary Magdalene's story begins at the intersection of history and myth, a crossroads where devotion, mystery, and controversy converge. To understand her significance, we must first step back into the world of first-century Judea, a land of tumult, where Roman rule pressed heavily upon the Jewish people, and sects of religious thought competed fiercely for influence. It was a world alive with prophets, zealots, and philosophers, yet few figures have captured the imagination across centuries as persistently as Mary Magdalene. She was a woman of mystery, a disciple, a witness, and, according to some interpretations, perhaps something far more consequential than history has dared to acknowledge. The Gospels portray her in brief but pivotal moments. She is present at the crucifixion. She observes from the shadows. She witnesses the moment of Jesus' death when many of his followers had fled. She is among the first to arrive at the empty tomb, a detail that scholars have long argued signifies an extraordinary role. For in a world dominated by patriarchal authority, she becomes the first to encounter the risen Christ. This is not a minor position. To stand at the center of life-altering events, to be entrusted with the earliest revelation of resurrection, is to occupy a space of spiritual and symbolic significance that cannot easily be ignored. Yet, the canonized texts are surprisingly sparse about her life beyond these episodes. Why? What has been left unsaid, and what was perhaps intentionally obscured? Mary Magdalene's portrayal underwent a dramatic transformation in later centuries. By the time of the early medieval church, she had been recast in many narratives as a penitent sinner. Her identity merged with that of a repentant prostitute in a manner that scholars now acknowledge is historically dubious. This reframing served a dual purpose. It marginalized her influence while providing a moral exemplar of redemption. But in doing so, it obscured a far more complex and compelling figure, one who may have held not only spiritual wisdom, but also knowledge, relationships, and perhaps a legacy that extended beyond the confines of the text. The dichotomy between Mary Magdalene, the revered disciple, and Mary Magdalene, the penitent sinner, speaks to the tension between truth and control, between historical reality and the narratives chosen to endure. Outside the canonical texts, whispers of her importance grow louder. Apocryphal Gospels and Gnostic writings, texts suppressed and hidden for centuries, paint a very different portrait. In these accounts, Mary Magdalene is not merely a follower of Jesus, but a confidant, a teacher, and at times, a visionary in her own right. She's depicted as understanding truths that others did not, as interpreting parables and mysteries in ways that the male disciples could not grasp. Some texts even suggest that she was privy to secret teachings, insights into divine knowledge that were never meant for the public eye. These writings hint at a role that goes beyond witness, a role that may have included the preservation of knowledge, wisdom, and, according to some theories, a bloodline destined to survive. It is within this tension, the historical, the canonical, and the hidden, that the fascination with Mary Magdalene thrives. She exists as both a historical figure and a symbol, a woman whose life and legacy challenge the boundaries of what is known and what is concealed. To explore her story is to navigate a landscape shaped as much by omission as by fact, a landscape where what is absent may be just as revealing as what is present. The gaps, the silences, the unexplored angles. These are the very spaces where secrets are often kept, waiting for those brave enough to seek them out. Mary Magdalene's significance is further heightened when we consider her in relation to Jesus. Traditional interpretations emphasize a spiritual hierarchy, with male disciples as primary conduits of doctrine. But alternative readings, those informed by Gnostic texts, esoteric traditions, and speculative scholarship, suggest a more intimate, even revolutionary connection. Some scholars and theorists have argued that she may have been more than a disciple, a partner, both spiritually and perhaps biologically, whose influence extended beyond the immediate circle of followers. This idea, though controversial, opens a door to one of history's most provocative hypotheses, that Mary Magdalene carried a lineage that could have survived through the centuries, hidden in plain sight, embedded within royal families or secret societies. Her historical presence is also marked by geographical traces. After the crucifixion, accounts, though heavily debated, suggest that Mary Magdalene traveled, possibly to Egypt or southern France, regions steeped in early Christian activity and esoteric tradition. These journeys, whether literal or symbolic, point to a life that was active, purposeful, and far-reaching. They imply a network of followers, protectors, and witnesses, all of whom may have played a role in preserving knowledge, and perhaps even lineage across generations. The notion that Mary Magdalene's story extends beyond Judea transforms her from a figure of historical curiosity into a central node in a web of mystery, devotion, and secrecy. By the end of this exploration, one truth becomes clear. Mary Magdalene was more than a disciple. She was a keeper of secrets, a figure whose presence in history is as profound as it is obscured. Her story is layered, complex, and deliberately enigmatic, a narrative woven with intentional silences and hidden meanings. To understand her fully, one must look beyond conventional histories, beyond the sanctioned texts, into the murky waters of suppressed knowledge, symbolic interpretation, and the whispers of esoteric tradition. As we move deeper into this journey, we begin to see how these threads, the historical Mary, the mythical Magdalene, the hidden teacher, and the potential progenitor of a bloodline, intertwine. Each fragment, each suggestion, each cryptic text adds weight to the notion that her legacy is not merely spiritual or symbolic. It is tangible, secret, and enduring. And it is precisely this hidden legacy that forms the foundation for the story we are about to unfold. A story of lineage, secrecy, and the enduring power of one remarkable woman whose impact may have rippled across Europe for centuries. The idea of a hidden bloodline descending from Mary Magdalene is one of the most tantalizing and controversial threads of historical speculation. At first glance, it seems almost impossible, a notion that challenges the foundation of Christian orthodoxy, upends centuries of accepted history, and flirts with the edges of conspiracy. And yet, the hypothesis has persisted, whispered in the margins of scholarly works, encoded in legends, and kept alive by those who dare to question what has been presented as absolute truth. The origins of this theory are as enigmatic as the woman herself. While the canonical texts remain silent, alternative writings and interpretations hint at a far more intimate connection between Mary Magdalene and Jesus than mainstream history acknowledges. Some scholars and historians, drawing on apocryphal Gospels, Gnostic manuscripts, and mystical texts, argue that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were not merely teacher and disciple. Instead, she may have been his closest companion, spiritually, emotionally, and perhaps even biologically. In these interpretations, the suggestion is subtle but profound. Mary Magdalene could have carried a legacy meant to survive beyond the turmoil of the first century, a lineage that would quietly weave itself into the fabric of European history. It was in the Middle Ages that whispers of this hidden bloodline began to take on a more concrete form. European writers, chroniclers, and esoteric thinkers, some inspired by fragments of earlier texts, others guided by legend, began hinting at a sacred lineage preserved through secrecy. The Merovingian dynasty, for example, was later associated with such a lineage, its early kings rumored to possess an enigmatic claim to divine ancestry. While contemporary historians often dismiss these connections as fanciful, the recurrence of certain symbols, rituals, and motifs suggests that a hidden narrative persisted, transmitted through generations in ways designed to evade scrutiny. One of the most compelling aspects of the bloodline hypothesis is the tension it creates between revelation and suppression. The Church, as the dominant religious authority, had immense power over which narratives were allowed to flourish and which were condemned to obscurity. Apocryphal Gospels, for instance, were systematically excluded from the canon, their contents deemed heretical or too dangerous for general dissemination. Within these texts, Mary Magdalene emerges not as a secondary figure, but as a principal interpreter of Jesus' teachings, sometimes even depicted as possessing wisdom that surpassed the male disciples. The suppression of these texts was not just an act of theological control, but, some theorists argue, a deliberate attempt to erase any acknowledgement of her potential role as a mother of a sacred lineage. The implications of this are staggering. To consider that Mary Magdalene may have had children and that their descendants could have survived in secrecy for centuries is to entertain a history that runs parallel to the one we know. It is a history where lineage, inheritance, and power are intertwined with secrecy and spiritual authority. European dynasties, from obscure local rulers to prominent royal houses, may have been part of a hidden network designed to protect and perpetuate this bloodline. Evidence, though circumstantial, is woven into legends of the Grail, in symbols etched into church architecture, and in the oral traditions of secretive sects that trace their origins back to the first followers of Jesus. Some of the earliest public mentions of this theory appear in medieval and early modern writings that flirt with forbidden knowledge. These works suggest that a sacred marriage, often referred to as the sacred union or hieros gamos, may have occurred between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. While the term can be interpreted symbolically, it is also read literally by some researchers as evidence that a bloodline was conceived with divine significance. The idea of a bloodline carrying spiritual and temporal authority is a motif repeated across cultures and epochs, lending weight to the plausibility of the theory within a historical and mythological framework. Yet, the bloodline hypothesis is more than just a speculation about genealogy. It is a lens through which to view the shaping of history itself. If this lineage did exist, the protection of its secrecy would have been of paramount importance. Guardians, allies, and networks of believers may have orchestrated marriages, alliances, and political strategies to shield it from those who would seek to eradicate or exploit it. The Knights Templar, for instance, are often linked to the safeguarding of secret knowledge, including the possibility of a hidden bloodline. Their sudden rise to prominence and equally sudden downfall has fueled centuries of speculation that they were, in part, custodians of a sacred inheritance too dangerous to be revealed openly. Throughout the Renaissance and into the modern era, the legend persisted, adapted, and transformed. Writers, alchemists, and mystics encoded references to the bloodline in art, literature, and secret societies. In France, the Languedoc region became a repository of heretical thought and cat-harm mysticism, its communities perhaps unknowingly safeguarding fragments of knowledge about this lineage. The notion of a bloodline that carried both spiritual and temporal significance appealed not only to esoteric thinkers, but also to political actors seeking legitimacy, creating a complex web of myth, secrecy, and historical intrigue. What makes the bloodline theory endlessly fascinating is its interplay between possibility and mystery. There is no definitive proof, no incontrovertible artifact, no unbroken genealogical record, but the convergence of legend, suppressed texts, and symbolic hints suggests a story that refuses to die. It challenges us to question the narratives we accept as truth, to look beyond official histories, and to consider that the most extraordinary secrets may be hidden in the most ordinary of places, within families, within royal courts, and within the enduring whispers of forgotten manuscripts. As we continue to explore this hidden lineage, it becomes clear that the story of Mary Magdalene is not merely about one woman's life. It is about a legacy carried through time, obscured by those who feared its power, and revealed in fragments to those willing to seek it. The bloodline hypothesis, controversial as it may be, is a gateway into a world where history, myth, and mystery collide. A world where the ordinary and the extraordinary meet in shadows, and where the truth, like a hidden river, flows quietly beneath the surface of what we think we know. The Holy Grail has long captivated the imagination, conjuring images of a sacred cup, shimmering with divine light, sought by knights and kings alike. But what if the Grail were more than a physical object, more than a chalice or relic? What if it were, in fact, a symbol, a coded emblem representing something far more profound? The bloodline of Mary Magdalene, a secret inheritance meant to endure through generations. To understand this perspective, we must look beyond the romanticized myths of medieval romance and delve into the hidden symbolism that has been carefully encoded in stories, rituals, and art throughout the centuries. In the earliest Grail legends, compiled by writers such as Chrétien de Troyes and later expanded by the Perceval and Parzival cycles, the Grail is described with extraordinary reverence, its properties almost miraculous, capable of sustaining life, granting insight, and conferring legitimacy upon those who possess it. Scholars and esoteric researchers have long argued that these descriptions are allegorical rather than literal. In this reading, the Grail is not a cup at all. It is a metaphor for lineage, a sacred bloodline carrying the essence of divine knowledge. The connection between the Grail and Mary Magdalene emerges from this perspective. The blood of Christ is not merely spiritual, but also tangible, inherited through descendants who preserve the union of spiritual wisdom and human heritage. This symbolic interpretation finds support in the recurring motif of the Grail as a vessel of femininity and fertility, rather than masculine authority alone. Mary Magdalene, in alternative historical readings, embodies the sacred feminine, a carrier of wisdom, insight, and continuity. The Grail legends, when read through this lens, suggest that the continuity of divine knowledge, and potentially the bloodline itself, was safeguarded through her descendants. Knights, sages, and secretive lineages, depicted as guardians of the Grail, may have been tasked with protecting not an object, but a living inheritance, a family whose significance was encoded in legend to ensure its survival while shielding it from scrutiny. The connection between the Grail and southern France is particularly striking. The Languedoc region, steeped in Cathar belief and mysticism, is often depicted in Grail literature as a place of secret wisdom and spiritual purity. Here, the line between history and legend blurs. The Cathars, who revered the feminine principle and rejected the corruption of institutionalized church authority, may have unknowingly preserved elements of this hidden knowledge. Some researchers suggest that Grail symbolism in this region, on church carvings, in illuminated manuscripts, and even within landscape geometry, conceals references to a sacred lineage descending from Mary Magdalene, a lineage protected through secrecy and coded ritual. Medieval chroniclers often encoded their knowledge carefully, layering meaning into every word and image. The symbolism of the Grail, when examined through this lens, becomes strikingly rich. The chalice may be a vessel of blood, but also of continuity. It is a representation of life preserved, knowledge transmitted, and divine authority conferred. Kings who sought the Grail were not simply pursuing legend. They were, in allegorical terms, seeking legitimacy and continuity, a validation of a bloodline and its sacred mission. In this context, the Grail ceases to be a distant myth and becomes a cipher, pointing toward an enduring secret that could reshape our understanding of history. Art and literature of the time further encode these hidden meanings. From the intricate carvings of cathedrals to the symbolism woven into manuscripts, the Grail is consistently associated with purity, feminine wisdom, and the mysterious other that exists beyond official record. Some researchers note parallels between Grail symbolism and depictions of Mary Magdalene herself, suggesting that medieval authors embedded her image and her legacy within their allegorical works. The pattern emerges across centuries. Where the Grail appears, there is also the suggestion of lineage, secrecy, and the preservation of hidden truth. The notion of the Grail as a bloodline rather than an object is radical, but it offers a cohesive explanation for many historical anomalies. Why would so many powerful individuals and orders dedicate their lives to its protection? Why do symbols recur in sacred spaces in ways that seem too deliberate to be coincidental? And why, across centuries, does the legend resist final resolution, always eluding those who seek a literal interpretation? The answer, some suggest, lies not in a chalice, but in the preservation of sacred secret. Mary Magdalene's legacy, safeguarded through generations, cloaked in allegory, and whispered in the annals of esoteric history. As we begin to trace the path from Magdalene to the Grail and beyond, the line between myth and history becomes increasingly porous. The Grail is both a story and a symbol, a bridge between the spiritual and the temporal, a reflection of humanity's enduring fascination with continuity, legitimacy, and hidden knowledge. In this reading, the Grail is not lost. It has never been an object to be found. It has always been a living inheritance, carried in secret by those who understood its power and significance. The journey to uncover this truth takes us further into medieval Europe, into dynasties and secret societies whose very existence may have been shaped by the need to protect this sacred legacy. From the enigmatic Merovingians to the vigilant Knights Templar, the threads of the Grail legend intertwine with historical currents, hinting at a hidden network dedicated to preserving Mary Magdalene's bloodline. And as we follow these threads, the narrative begins to reveal a deeper, more intricate story, one of lineage, secrecy, and the quiet, enduring influence of a woman whose life and legacy have been hidden in plain sight for nearly 2 millennia. In contemplating the Grail as a symbol of lineage, one begins to understand the audacity and the beauty of the hidden bloodline hypothesis. It is a story that transcends legend and history, connecting the spiritual, the political, and the mystical into a tapestry of intrigue. And as we continue this exploration, the Grail will guide us, not to a relic of the past, but to a revelation of enduring legacy, a secret preserved in flesh and blood, encoded in myth, and whispered across the ages by those who understood that some truths must remain hidden to survive. In the dim corridors of early medieval Europe, a dynasty arose whose very existence would later be shrouded in legend, myth, and whispered speculation, the Merovingians. They were known as the long-haired kings, rulers of the Frankish tribes, whose reigns stretched from the 5th to the 8th century. Yet, behind their visible crowns and public authority, some historians and esoteric researchers argue that they carried a secret far older and far more extraordinary than mere kingship. a lineage said to descend from Mary Magdalene herself, a hidden bloodline intertwined with both spiritual and temporal power. The Merovingians were unlike other dynasties of their time. Their kingship was marked by peculiar customs and symbols that set them apart. Long, flowing hair as a sign of divine right, mysterious relics, and rituals that seemed to echo forgotten traditions. Chroniclers of the era noted these customs with fascination and, sometimes, apprehension. Why would a dynasty insist on such distinct practices unless they carried meaning beyond the surface? In the esoteric interpretation, these traits were not mere eccentricities. They were markers of sacred heritage, coded symbols indicating the continuation of a lineage whose significance extended far beyond the Frankish realm. Some scholars point to the Merovingian association with the Grail legends as more than coincidence. Medieval romances and chronicles frequently link the dynasty to sacred vessels, hidden treasures, and divine favor, hinting that the bloodline they protected was not ordinary. The holy blood attributed to them, whether literal or symbolic, suggests an inheritance of both spiritual and temporal authority, passed down from a line considered sacred. If one accepts the premise that Mary Magdalene carried a lineage destined to survive, the Merovingians emerge as its most visible early guardians, rulers whose power was legitimized not only by conquest, but by secrecy, faith, and a preserved legacy. The history of the Merovingians is, in many ways, mysterious. Their sudden rise to prominence, the peculiarities of succession, and their eventual decline all point to a dynasty whose story was closely guarded, often manipulated, and frequently misunderstood. Chroniclers from the Carolingian period, which succeeded the Merovingians, were eager to legitimize their own rule by discrediting the old kings, depicting them as decadent, weak, or ineffectual. Could this systematic marginalization have been, in part, a cover-up to obscure the true significance of the Merovingian bloodline? Some theorists argue that it is no accident that their legacy is fragmented, their narrative obscured, leaving only tantalizing hints in texts, symbols, and oral traditions. The Merovingians' reputed guardianship of a sacred bloodline also connects them to other enigmatic elements of medieval Europe. The Knights Templar, for instance, who would later rise to prominence, are often depicted as protectors of the Grail and its associated lineage. The Cathars, persecuted in southern France, revered spiritual principles that aligned with the preservation of hidden knowledge, and their communities may have unknowingly served as custodians of fragments of the secret. The intertwining of these groups, across time and geography, forms a web of guardianship, all potentially linked by the singular purpose of preserving a sacred inheritance traced back to Mary Magdalene. The symbolism associated with the Merovingians is particularly revealing. Their heraldry, iconography, and even burial practices suggest a deep reverence for a lineage considered holy. Long hair, often noted in chronicles, was not merely decorative but a visible emblem of sacred status, assigned to those who understood its meaning. Some theorists propose that hidden messages, encoded in art, architecture, and ritual, reinforced the dynasty's identity as both temporal rulers and custodians of a secret spiritual inheritance. Every coronation, every ceremonial act, may have been a deliberate performance designed to acknowledge a legacy invisible to the uninitiated but unmistakable to those in the know. The very idea that a royal dynasty could secretly preserve a bloodline across centuries may seem improbable, yet the Merovingian story is peppered with anomalies that invite closer examination. Sudden shifts in power, unexplained alliances, and the emergence of legendary figures such as Clovis I, all framed against the backdrop of a Europe in chaos, suggest that a deeper narrative may have been at work. In this reading, the Merovingians were not merely kings. They were stewards of a sacred lineage, their reign a carefully orchestrated continuation of a secret heritage with roots in the earliest Christian era. Even the decline of the Merovingians, often portrayed as the natural consequence of decadence or incompetence, may have concealed another truth. Their eventual displacement by the Carolingians did not erase their legacy entirely. Instead, the bloodline, hidden and protected, may have continued through less visible channels, passing into noble houses and secretive networks that quietly ensured its survival. In this sense, the Merovingians were not an endpoint, but a pivotal chapter in a story that stretches across centuries, a chapter that connects Mary Magdalene to the modern world through symbols, marriages, and guardianship of knowledge. The Merovingian mystery, then, is not only a tale of kings and conquests, but a story of secrecy, continuity, and hidden power. It is a story that bridges the ancient and medieval worlds, linking biblical times to European dynasties, legend to history, and myth to tangible influence. To consider the Merovingians in this light is to recognize that history is often shaped as much by what is concealed as by what is revealed. Their reign, their rituals, and their peculiar legacy invite us to look deeper, to question accepted narratives, and to see the possibility of a hidden thread connecting Mary Magdalene to the heart of Europe itself. As we continue this journey, the Merovingians serve as a gateway into the larger tapestry of secrecy and guardianship. They are the first kings in a chain of history that may have preserved Mary Magdalene's bloodline, guiding us toward the next key players in this hidden story: the Templars, the mystics, and the secret societies whose vigilance ensured that one of history's greatest secrets survived the centuries, waiting for those who could finally piece it together. In the shadowed chapters of medieval history, one organization has consistently captured the imagination of both historians and conspiracy theorists: the Knights Templar. Founded in the early 12th century to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, the Templars quickly rose to unprecedented power, wealth, and influence. But beneath their military and financial might lies a more enigmatic role, one whispered about in manuscripts, legends, and the veiled corners of history. Some researchers argue that the Templars were more than warriors and bankers. They were guardians of a secret, custodians of a legacy far older and more sacred than mere land or treasure. A legacy that may have been tied to the hidden bloodline of Mary Magdalene. The Templars' sudden rise is remarkable. In less than a century, they amassed vast estates, controlled extensive banking networks, and earned the loyalty of kings and popes alike. Yet their ascent was not solely material. It was also symbolic. The Templars were entrusted with knowledge, relics, and secrets that others dared not possess. Among these, some believe, was the protection of a lineage descending from Mary Magdalene, an inheritance intertwined with spiritual authority and historical significance. The order's strict codes, hierarchical secrecy, and ritualized practices suggest a vigilance not merely over lands and treasure, but over truths too dangerous to be openly acknowledged. Central to this theory is the notion of the Templars as intermediaries between the sacred and the temporal. Medieval chronicles and later legends hint that the order guarded relics associated with Christ, but alternative interpretations suggest a deeper mission. The Holy Grail, long considered an object of myth, may have been a symbolic reference to Mary Magdalene's bloodline, and the Templars, with their strategic positions across Europe and the Holy Land, were ideally placed to protect it. Their fortresses, hidden passages, and coded manuscripts may have been designed not only to safeguard treasures, but to conceal knowledge of a lineage meant to endure in secrecy. The Templars' sudden downfall only adds to the intrigue. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, King Philip IV of France, heavily indebted to the order, orchestrated the arrest of Templars across the kingdom, accusing them of heresy, blasphemy, and unthinkable crimes. Many were tortured, imprisoned, and executed. Yet some historians and esoteric researchers argue that the real threat posed by the Templars was not financial. It was informational. If the order truly guarded a sacred lineage or a secret of immense historical and spiritual significance, eliminating them would have been a strategic move to erase knowledge that could challenge the established church and crown. The dramatic suppression of the Templars thus reads not merely as political maneuvering, but as the deliberate erasure of a hidden truth. Legends surrounding the Templars abound, hinting at their clandestine activities. Some accounts suggest that they recovered relics, transported them in secret, and encoded information about the sacred bloodline in manuscripts, architectural symbols, and ritualistic ceremonies. Their network extended across Europe and the Middle East, connecting monasteries, fortresses, and royal courts, creating a web of influence capable of preserving knowledge beyond the reach of authorities. Even after the order's official dissolution, traces of their presence lingered in secret societies, mystical orders, and cryptic traditions, suggesting that their mission, whatever its true nature, did not end with the burning of their leaders. The Templars' relationship with France is particularly significant. The Languedoc region, already a hub of Cathar mysticism and esoteric belief, may have served as a refuge for elements of knowledge and guardianship. It is here that the Templars reportedly maintained strongholds, possibly safeguarding relics and information tied to the Grail and, by extension, Mary Magdalene's bloodline. Their sudden and brutal suppression in this region may have had less to do with heresy than with the desire to control a lineage and the knowledge it carried. Knowledge powerful enough to challenge the authority of both king and pope. The symbolism and rituals of the Templars themselves are suggestive. Initiation ceremonies, strict oaths, and hierarchical secrecy created a disciplined environment in which knowledge could be preserved and transmitted to those deemed worthy. Esoteric researchers point to recurring motifs in Templar seals, manuscripts, and architecture that hint at a connection to the Grail, sacred blood, and the hidden feminine principle, associations that align with the broader narrative of Mary Magdalene's lineage. Every fortress, every ceremony, every coded manuscript may have served as both protection and instruction, ensuring that the secret survived despite persecution and time. The allure of the Templars lies not only in what they possessed, but in what they represented: vigilance over the sacred and the hidden. To consider their role in the context of Mary Magdalene's bloodline is to view them not merely as warriors or financiers, but as custodians of one of history's greatest secrets. Their story, intertwined with faith, power, and legend, provides a bridge between the early Christian world and medieval Europe, between the historical and the symbolic. As we trace this narrative forward, the Templars emerge as a crucial link in the preservation of a sacred legacy. They are the bridge between Mary Magdalene's time and the later dynasties, secret societies, and esoteric traditions that carried her story forward. Through their vigilance, her bloodline, whether literal or symbolic, may have been shielded from the destructive forces of history, leaving only traces in legend, architecture, and coded texts. In their shadowed halls and secret chambers, the possibility of continuity endured, a testament to the power of secrecy, devotion, and the belief that some truths are too precious to be revealed openly. The story of the Templars, then, is inseparable from the story of Mary Magdalene's hidden legacy. They illuminate a path of guardianship that spans centuries, connecting the earliest whispers of her significance to the later mythologies of Europe. To understand the Templars is to glimpse the mechanisms by which a sacred secret might survive the relentless passage of time. A secret so profound that its protection required devotion, courage, and, ultimately, sacrifice. Throughout Europe, the story of Mary Magdalene and her hidden legacy is whispered not only in texts and chronicles, but in the very stone and glass of its cathedrals, castles, and sacred spaces. For those who know where to look, art and architecture are more than aesthetic triumphs. They are repositories of encoded knowledge, cryptic messages deliberately hidden in plain sight. From the intricate patterns of Gothic cathedrals to the symbolism woven into Renaissance paintings, a secret language emerges, one that may point to the preservation of Mary Magdalene's bloodline and the esoteric truths guarded by those who sought to protect it. Consider the cathedrals of France, particularly Chartres, Notre Dame, and Sainte Marie Magdalene in Vézelay. At first glance, these structures inspire awe through their sheer scale, their soaring spires, and the delicate tracery of stone and glass. But look closer, and a different story begins to unfold. The geometry of the buildings, the placement of statues, the recurring motifs of flowers, chalices, and feminine figures, all suggest more than decoration. Some researchers argue that these are coded messages, symbols of the sacred feminine, the Grail, and the continuity of a lineage carefully guarded across centuries. Even the seemingly mundane elements, the direction of a staircase, the shape of a rose window, the position of a column, may encode knowledge accessible only to those trained to interpret these hidden signals. Renaissance art offers similar clues. Paintings of biblical scenes, while ostensibly illustrating scripture, often contain anomalies that hint at alternative narratives. Mary Magdalene is frequently depicted with an air of prominence, her gaze, gestures, or placement suggesting knowledge, power, or a central role far beyond that of a mere disciple. Artists such as Leonardo da Vinci and later masters may have been aware of esoteric traditions, encoding symbols that preserve her significance in subtle, yet deliberate, ways. The chalices, scrolls, and peculiar halos that appear in these works are interpreted by some historians as reminders of her spiritual and possibly genetic inheritance, veiled so that only the initiated could discern their meaning. Even the layout of towns and sacred sites reflects this hidden language. Pilgrimage routes, ley lines, and the positioning of abbeys and churches across southern France and northern Spain may map out a symbolic landscape, guiding those who knew where to look toward knowledge, relics, or safe havens connected to Mary Magdalene's legacy. The Cathars, whose communities flourished in Languedoc, are believed by some researchers to have intuitively followed these patterns, preserving fragments of hidden wisdom that linked sacred geography to a sacred lineage. The symbolism is not limited to Europe. Artifacts recovered from the Holy Land, illuminated manuscripts, and ritual objects suggest a continuity of esoteric knowledge stretching from the early Christian world to medieval Europe. The repetition of certain motifs, serpents, chalices, roses, and intertwined geometric patterns, hints at a visual language intended to encode truth while shielding it from those uninitiated in the mysteries. This is the essence of esoteric preservation, conveying messages through symbols, art, and architecture rather than overt text, ensuring survival through subtlety and secrecy. Even the Gothic cathedrals themselves tell a story of duality. Their light and shadow, the interplay of stained glass, and the intricacy of stone carvings embody a tension between revelation and concealment. To the casual observer, these details are purely decorative. To the trained eye, they are deliberate messages, a map of sacred knowledge pointing toward Mary Magdalene, the Grail, and the secret lineage. Rose windows may encode genealogical patterns. Tympanums may depict allegorical representations of spiritual truths. Statues and gargoyles may serve as cryptic guides to hidden knowledge. Every element of design, every painstaking detail, contributes to a silent narrative preserved in stone. Even the artists and architects themselves were often part of this hidden network. Many were members of guilds, brotherhoods, or societies that practiced esoteric traditions, passing knowledge from master to apprentice in secret. The mastery required to execute these works was not purely technical. It was symbolic, spiritual, and encoded with layers of meaning meant to endure across centuries. Through this lens, art and architecture become not merely aesthetic achievements, but deliberate acts of preservation, a way to ensure that the story of Mary Magdalene and her lineage could survive the turbulence of history, censorship, and persecution. This use of hidden codes is mirrored in literature as well. Allegorical texts, mystical poetry, and illuminated manuscripts contain recurring symbols associated with the Grail and sacred feminine. Writers encoded messages in colors, shapes, and textual structures, often layering multiple meanings to protect the knowledge while providing hints to those able to read the signs. The result is a complex web of interconnected clues that point toward an enduring truth: the preservation of Mary Magdalene's influence, knowledge, and possibly her lineage, through means designed to elude casual observation. The significance of these hidden symbols lies in their continuity. Across centuries, from the early Gothic cathedrals of France to the intricate paintings of the Renaissance, the message remains consistent. Mary Magdalene is central. The sacred bloodline, the Grail, and the feminine principle are interwoven into art and architecture as a coded testament to a history that official records either ignored or actively suppressed. Each stone, each brushstroke, and each carved figure serves as a silent witness to a story too profound to be told openly, yet too important to be lost. As we examine these symbols, it becomes clear that art and architecture function as a bridge across time, connecting the secretive custodians of the past to the present. They are both a warning and an invitation. A warning to those who would exploit or suppress knowledge, and an invitation to those who seek the hidden truths of history. The coded messages embedded in these works are enduring proof that Mary Magdalene's legacy, whether spiritual, symbolic, or biological, has been deliberately safeguarded. In this way, Europe itself becomes a living archive of hidden knowledge. Every cathedral, painting, and sacred site is part of a subtle map, tracing the presence of Mary Magdalene and the guardians of her lineage. By understanding this visual language, we begin to see the deliberate efforts of those who, for centuries, sought to preserve one of history's greatest secrets, a hidden bloodline protected by symbols, art, and architecture, awaiting those who could read the signs and uncover the truth that has long been concealed. Southern France has long been a land where history and legend intertwine, where rolling vineyards and ancient villages hide stories that mainstream chronicles have either forgotten or deliberately obscured. It is here, in the Languedoc region, that whispers of Mary Magdalene's hidden legacy grow louder, where the remnants of spiritual movements, mystical orders, and secretive communities suggest a landscape shaped by guardianship, secrecy, and devotion. This region, bathed in sunlight and shadow, emerges as the heart of Europe's most enduring mystery, a place where sacred bloodlines and forbidden knowledge converged under the watchful eyes of those who understood their significance. The Languedoc region was a hotbed of religious and spiritual experimentation in the Middle Ages. Catharism, a movement considered heretical by the Catholic Church, flourished here, advocating a dualistic worldview in which the spiritual and material realms were starkly contrasted. The Cathars revered purity, often embracing ascetic lifestyles and emphasizing the feminine principle in ways that challenged the patriarchal norms of the time. While the Cathars may not have explicitly known about Mary Magdalene's bloodline, their reverence for the sacred feminine and their devotion to preserving esoteric knowledge position them as unlikely allies, or at least as a cultural environment conducive to the survival of hidden legacies. Cities and villages in this region, from Albi to Carcassonne to Montségur, became centers of resistance, learning, and spiritual preservation. Montségur, perched atop a rocky escarpment, is particularly emblematic, a fortress of stone that withstood sieges and became a symbol of defiance against both temporal and religious authority. Some researchers propose that Montségur was more than a military stronghold. It may have served as a repository of sacred knowledge, a sanctuary for texts, relics, and traditions that linked back to Mary Magdalene and her hidden legacy. The fortress stands as a testament to the determination of those who sought to protect knowledge from suppression, a silent witness to the persistence of a secret that many sought to eradicate. The region's geography itself seems to conspire in favor of secrecy. Hidden valleys, winding rivers, and remote mountains provided natural protection, creating sanctuaries where communities could flourish relatively undisturbed. It is within these natural strongholds that knowledge, and perhaps even lineage, could be preserved. Oral traditions, local rituals, and hidden texts passed down through generations may have served as a living archive, a way to maintain continuity when written records were forbidden or destroyed. In this way, the land itself became an active participant in the preservation of history that the wider world was not meant to see. Southern France was also a crossroads of European and Mediterranean cultures. Pilgrimage routes, trade paths, and political alliances brought travelers, merchants, and emissaries into contact with hidden knowledge, allowing for the transmission of esoteric traditions across regions. It is here that coded symbols in churches, manuscripts, and local architecture began to converge, forming a network of subtle references to sacred lineages, the Grail, and Mary Magdalene herself. The convergence of geography, culture, and secrecy in Languedoc makes it a natural repository for a legacy meant to survive against the forces of both ignorance and persecution. The Albigensian Crusade, launched in the early 13th century, dramatically illustrates the stakes of this hidden knowledge. The Catholic Church, viewing the Cathars as a threat to its authority, sought to eradicate the movement entirely. Castles were besieged, communities destroyed, and texts burnt. Yet, despite the ferocity of this suppression, whispers of the secret endured. Survivors, whether Cathar or sympathizers, carried fragments of knowledge, encoded traditions, and perhaps even traces of bloodlines into safer territories. This cataclysm, while devastating, inadvertently ensured that the hidden legacy continued to move, adapt, and survive, hidden from the eyes of the powerful, but preserved in plain sight for those who knew where to look. The legacy of Mary Magdalene in southern France is further reinforced by local legends and oral traditions. Stories of a mysterious woman arriving from the east, of sacred relics hidden in remote chapels, and of secret marriages that shaped the course of noble families all hint at the presence of a lineage that defies conventional history. These narratives, often dismissed by mainstream historians as folklore, gain significance when considered alongside the coded symbols in art, architecture, and manuscripts throughout the region. Together, they form a tapestry of continuity, connecting past to present, legend to potential historical reality. Even today, traces of this hidden history linger. Pilgrimages, secret ceremonies, and the enduring fascination with Cathar sites speak to a cultural memory that refuses to be erased. Scholars, esoteric researchers, and local storytellers all acknowledge, in one way or another, that southern France was not merely a backdrop for medieval events. It was a stage for the preservation of knowledge, power, and possibly lineage. It is a place where the hidden bloodline of Mary Magdalene could plausibly have survived, shielded by geography, culture, and devoted guardianship. In considering southern France as the heart of the secret, one sees the interplay between history and myth, between destruction and preservation, between suppression and survival. The land itself, with its fortified castles, sacred sites, and hidden valleys, becomes a character in this story, a silent protector of secrets too powerful to be revealed and too precious to be lost. And it is within this landscape, shaped by devotion, secrecy, and resilience that the threads of Mary Magdalene's legacy weave a narrative that stretches across centuries, inviting us to follow the trail of mystery and discovery into the next chapters of this hidden history. Cloaked in the quiet folds of the French Pyrenees lies a village so small and unassuming that most travelers pass through it without a second thought. Yet, for more than a century, Rennes-le-Château has been the epicenter of one of Europe's most perplexing historical enigmas. The story begins not with ancient kings or medieval crusaders, but with an ordinary parish priest named Bérenger Saunière, an unremarkable figure whose life would collide with legends of sacred bloodlines, hidden manuscripts, and a secret so dangerous that it allegedly altered the course of his fate. When Saunière arrived in the late 1800s, the hilltop village was impoverished, its church weathered and almost forgotten. The old structure, dedicated to Mary Magdalene, had stood for centuries, holding within its crumbling walls stories long dismissed as folklore. Saunière's assignment was simple: restore the chapel and bring some order back to the isolated parish. But as the priest began his renovation, he uncovered something that would change everything. Something buried within the stones, hidden beneath the altars, concealed inside coded inscriptions that no one had paid attention to for generations. According to the earliest reports, Saunière found a set of parchments sealed inside a hollowed wooden pillar supporting the church's ancient altar. Pale, brittle, and written in a script that mixed Latin with cryptic symbols, the documents were unlike anything he had seen. Some said they contained genealogies stretching back to the early Middle Ages. Others whispered that the parchments referenced a hidden lineage, one tied not to the kings of France, but to a sacred family whose origins traced back to the time of Christ. Whatever the truth, Saunière took the documents, studied them privately, and then traveled to Paris without explanation. It was upon returning that the most extraordinary shift occurred. Once a poor priest living on modest earnings, Saunière suddenly possessed enormous wealth. He began spending lavishly, as though a vast treasury had fallen into his hands. He constructed a grand villa, built a tower library he called the Tour Magdala, adorned the church with bizarre symbols, and redesigned the grounds with meticulous, esoteric patterns. Visitors reported statues of demons, inverted inscriptions, and carvings of Mary Magdalene placed in poses that seemed almost coded. Every detail felt intentional, every object a fragment of a message. Whispers spread quickly. How had a rural priest amassed a fortune so large? Donations alone could not explain it. And why would he redesign a Christian church using symbols that were not merely unusual, but openly heretical? Some believe Saunière had uncovered treasure, perhaps gold transported from Jerusalem by the Visigoths or the plunder of long-forgotten kings. Others thought he had unearthed documents that could destabilize the church itself, evidence of a sacred bloodline protected in secret for over a millennium. If such a secret were real, those in positions of power would pay any amount to keep it hidden. The church, sensing something amiss, eventually summoned Saunière to explain his sudden wealth. He refused to reveal his source of income, and as a result, he was suspended from priestly duties. Yet, even stripped of his title, he continued guarding whatever truth he had discovered. He shared nothing, neither publicly nor in confession. And then, just days before his death in 1917, he summoned his closest friend and confidant, the village abbé, for a final meeting. According to local tales, the priest who received Saunière's last confession emerged pale, shaken, and refused to ever speak of what he had heard. He lived the remainder of his life in silence, marked by a strange, lingering dread. After Saunière's death, rumors intensified. His surviving companion, the enigmatic Marie de Narnaud, lived in the villa for decades. She hinted repeatedly that she held a secret capable of making someone extremely rich, rich enough to rule. Many attempted to convince her to reveal what Sonier had left behind, but she withheld the truth until her own final days. And then, in a moment of clarity before passing, she tried to speak, only to have her voice fail her completely. Her secret died with her, leaving behind only the cryptic symbols in the church, the tower he built, and a trail of clues mixed with misinformation. What makes Rennes-le-Château so compelling is not simply the mystery of Sonier's wealth. It is the setting itself. The region is dense with the remnants of ancient civilizations, Visigothic fortresses, Cathar strongholds, and ruins associated with the earliest Christian communities in Europe. Local legends belong to a lineage of stories tied to Mary Magdalene's supposed arrival in Gaul. The landscape is embroidered with folklore that speaks of a hidden royal line, a bloodline preserved across centuries, shielded by secret orders and devout guardians. Researchers who have visited the village often describe a strange atmosphere, as though the land carries a memory it is reluctant to release. Even the hilltop offers a symbolic vantage point. From Sonier's tower, one can see vast stretches of countryside once controlled by those rumored to protect ancient genealogies. Drawn to the legend, cryptographers, historians, mystics, and treasure hunters have spent decades attempting to decode the inscriptions left by Sonier. Some point to patterns in the church floor tiles, others to Latin phrases carved above the door, and still others to the peculiar arrangement of statues and stained glass. One theory, popular among esoteric historians, proposes that the priest intentionally embedded a map, an encoded representation of a larger secret hidden somewhere beneath the hills. Another suggests that Sonier uncovered evidence of the sacred bloodline, a genealogy connecting the Merovingian kings to Mary Magdalene, preserved by medieval custodians and shielded from the church. If he had found such documents, his sudden wealth could have been payment for his silence, either from those seeking to protect the bloodline or from authorities seeking to bury it forever. The mystery deepened further when modern investigators discovered references to Rennes-le-Château in documents associated with esoteric societies of the 19th and 20th centuries. Some describe the region as a dormant rose, a place where the feminine divine, the legacy of Mary Magdalene, had once been preserved. Others pointed to the region as a sanctuary of the sang-real, the royal blood. Even if these connections were exaggerated or invented, they fueled a growing belief that the village lay at the heart of a suppressed chapter in European history. What remains today is a riddle carved in stone and silence. Rennes-le-Château is no longer a forgotten village. It is a pilgrimage site for seekers of mysteries both spiritual and historical. Visitors stand before Sonier's reconstructed altar, tracing their fingers over inscriptions that refuse to give up their meaning. They climb the steps of the tower, imagining the priest reading forbidden manuscripts in the solitude of his library. And they walk the pathways he once traveled, wondering if the secret he carried was a treasure, a truth, or a bloodline, one that could rewrite everything we think we know about the past. In the end, Rennes-le-Château stands not as a solved mystery, but as an invitation to consider that some truths are guarded not because they are false, but because they are powerful enough to reshape history, faith, and the story of Europe itself. Across the shifting landscape of European history, the rise and fall of royal dynasties has always been framed as a series of political maneuvers, alliances made through marriage, treaties sealed with signatures, and bloodlines carefully recorded in gilded genealogies. Yet beneath the polished surface of heraldry and crowns lies another narrative, quieter and far more elusive. It is the whispered idea that some families scattered across France, Scotland, Spain, and beyond trace their lineage back not to medieval warlords or ancient tribal kings, but to a far older and more sacred origin. The bloodline said to descend from Mary Magdalene in an unbroken line that traveled with her into the shadowed corners of Gaul. Generations of researchers have found it difficult to dismiss certain patterns. Recurring symbols and coats of arms, persistent legends that cling to particular noble houses, and genealogical gaps that appear precisely where questions matter most. These patterns do not form a neat or linear story. Instead, they resemble fragments of a tapestry that has been intentionally unraveled, leaving behind only threads. And yet, even these scattered remnants suggest that the idea of a hidden sacred lineage was not only believed, but quietly acknowledged among certain European elites. The earliest whispers appear in medieval chronicles describing the Merovingian kings, whose mystique would linger long after their political power faded. Chroniclers such as Fredegar wrote of their divine spark, a radiant quality separating them from others. Their long hair, kept uncut as a sacred symbol, contributed to the perception that they were not merely rulers, but custodians of an ancient and holy descent. While modern historians attribute this to myth-making, esoteric traditions point to something more profound: the belief that the Merovingians were linked to the earliest Christians of southern Gaul, those said to have preserved the teachings and lineage of Mary Magdalene. If such a connection existed, it would have quietly filtered into later royal families through intermarriage, forming invisible veins of sacred blood coursing beneath Europe's political structures. As centuries passed, the Merovingians were succeeded by the Carolingians and later the Capetians, but their mystique survived. Medieval French families continued to claim, with careful ambiguity, a connection to ancient blood that predated the formation of their kingdoms. Researchers studying private family archives occasionally reported coded references to a line of the mother, a phrase that appears curiously out of place in the patriarchal frameworks of medieval nobility. Some believe this referred to Mary, the mother of Christ, but others insisted that the phrase was used with deliberate vagueness, concealing the possibility that it referred instead to Mary Magdalene. In southern France especially, noble houses in the regions of Languedoc and Provence maintained traditions subtly tied to Magdalene lore. Certain families bore symbols such as the red rose, the bee, and the five-petaled star, motifs long associated with the feminine divine and, in some esoteric circles, with the Magdalene herself. While these symbols can be explained through various cultural and religious influences, their recurring appearance among families linked through intermarriage to old Merovingian lines has kept the speculation alive. Even more intriguing are the regions where these families lived, areas where Magdalene legends are strongest, and where shrines, caves, and ancient chapels maintain her memory with unusual intensity. Across the sea in Scotland, the story continues in a different but equally compelling form. The Scottish royal lineage, particularly the early House of Stuart, has long been rumored to possess blood ties to ancient families of Gaul. This connection was reinforced through centuries of intermarriage between Scottish nobles and continental families who themselves traced descent from the Merovingians. Some royal genealogies contain unexplained insertions of French lines, with marriages noted only briefly or with gaps where names should be. These gaps, for some researchers, are evidence of intentional obscuration, moments where a lineage too sensitive or too revealing was quietly concealed. One of the most persistent theories involves the marriage of the early Stuarts into families connected to the Counts of Toulouse and the region of Rennes-le-Château, itself a hotspot of Magdalene lore. Whether coincidental or deliberate, the cross-pollination of these lines has fed the belief that the sacred bloodline, if it survived the turmoil of medieval France, may have flowed northward into Scotland, merging with its royal house. Such an idea gained renewed attention in the 20th century when esoteric writers linked the Stuart genealogy to the so-called Grail families, claiming that certain branches retained knowledge of their descent and guarded it in secrecy. Spain, too, contributes its own echoes to the story. In the rugged regions of Aragon and Catalonia, noble houses such as the Montcada and the Barcelona counts carried legends that their lineage intertwined with holy blood arriving from Gaul in ancient times. Their family seals often featured symbols associated with Magdalene devotion, including chalices, roses, and radiant stars. The Catalan Pyrenees, geographically close to Occitania, where Magdalene traditions flourished, became a refuge for families fleeing religious persecution, especially during the Albigensian Crusade. Some researchers propose that these families were targeted not only for their Cathar beliefs, but for their role in preserving esoteric knowledge tied to a sacred lineage. Whether these connections are coincidental or intentional remains a matter of debate. But what cannot be denied is the extraordinary persistence of certain symbols and legends across families separated by geography and time. It is as though a quiet thread runs beneath the surface, weaving through the histories of France, Scotland, and Spain, creating intersections that defy simple explanation. Even within the courts of Europe, whispers of sacred descent occasionally emerged in the form of subtle references. Some monarchs were described by their contemporaries as possessing the divine right, in a manner that implied something inherited rather than granted. While divine right was a standard justification for monarchy, certain descriptions emphasize qualities of spiritual legitimacy rather than political authority. In rare instances, chroniclers would write that a king or queen carried the light of the rose, a phrase that esoteric scholars interpret as a veiled acknowledgement of a sacred lineage tied to the Magdalene. As Europe modernized, these whispers did not entirely fade. Instead, they transformed into quiet rumors spoken behind the heavy doors of old estates. In the 18th and 19th centuries, when Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism flourished, some aristocrats joined esoteric circles that preserved rituals honoring the feminine divine. Several lodges in France and Scotland conducted ceremonies invoking the Lady of the Grail, often portrayed not as the Virgin Mary, but as Mary Magdalene. Whether symbolic or literal, the interest in Magdalene as a figure of spiritual lineage persisted among those with ancestral ties to regions steeped in her legend. In the private archives of certain noble families, archives rarely open to public scholars, there are said to be genealogies, diaries, and correspondences that mention connections to ancient guardians of the rose. Some claim these records include cryptic references to a bloodline preserved through carefully arranged marriages, a lineage quietly acknowledged but never openly declared. While such claims are difficult to verify, their existence fuels the belief that Europe's past may hold secrets far more intricate than official history suggests. What makes this possibility so compelling is not any single piece of evidence, but the accumulation of subtle signals, symbols repeated across centuries, marriages linking families tied to regions rich in Magdalene lore, genealogical anomalies appearing precisely where one would expect concealment, and a persistent aura of reverence surrounding certain lineages. These elements do not prove the existence of a hidden sacred bloodline, but they shape an atmosphere in which the possibility feels neither improbable nor accidental. If such a lineage truly exists, it would not appear in the public genealogies displayed in museums or textbooks. It would live instead in the quiet corners of family archives, encoded emblems carved into ancient stone, in the whispered traditions passed between generations. And perhaps, if the legends are true, it would still flow in the veins of certain families living among us. Families whose ancestry holds a secret capable of reshaping the spiritual, political, and historical foundations of Europe. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, Europe stepped into an era of rediscovery, an age when forgotten knowledge resurfaced, long-concealed ideas reawakened, and the boundaries between art, mysticism, and forbidden history blurred in ways that have never been fully understood. It was a time when artists were not merely painters or sculptors, but keepers of secrets, guardians of symbols, and transmitters of ideas that could not safely be spoken aloud. In this shifting world of intellectual revival, Mary Magdalene emerged not simply as a biblical figure, but as an esoteric presence hidden in the brushstrokes, geometry, and allegories of Renaissance masterpieces. The public story was always safe, always orthodox. Artists painted saints, biblical scenes, and classical myth for patrons who wanted beauty and religious devotion expressed through art. But beneath these sanctioned depictions, certain details whisper a different narrative, one that subtly elevates the Magdalene, portrays her with unexpected authority, or embeds symbols long associated with sacred femininity and the possibility of a hidden bloodline. These artistic anomalies are often overlooked by casual viewers, yet they stand out sharply to those who know what to look for. Perhaps the most frequently cited example appears in the works attributed to Leonardo da Vinci. Whether or not all the interpretations are accurate, one cannot deny that Leonardo's portrayals of sacred figures often contain a quiet defiance, an invitation to look beyond surface appearances. The most famous example, of course, is the figure seated to the right of Jesus in the Last Supper. Traditionally identified as the Apostle John, the figure's delicate features, folded hands, and flowing hair have fueled centuries of debate. Some scholars suggest that Leonardo intentionally feminized the figure to represent purity and youth. Others believe he was deliberately portraying Mary Magdalene, subtly inserting her into the central narrative where tradition had removed her. Whether or not Leonardo meant to challenge the official story, the ambiguity is powerful. The composition, the placement, and the mirroring posture between the two figures create an almost complementary symmetry, as though they are two halves of a unified center. Some observers see in this arrangement not merely a theological point, but a hint at partnership or lineage. Leonardo, after all, was fascinated by codes, symbols, and hidden meanings. It would not be out of character for him to embed a message intended only for those with the eyes to see it. But Leonardo was not alone. Across Europe, artists began portraying Magdalene with attributes that seemed out of alignment with earlier traditions. In earlier centuries, she was usually depicted as a penitent sinner, dust on her feet, tears staining her face, clutching a jar of ointment in remorse. But during the Renaissance, something shifted. Magdalene began to appear in luxurious garments, seated with books rather than relics, her expression contemplative rather than sorrowful. She became a teacher, a figure of wisdom, almost regal in her presence. This transformation suggests that some artists viewed her not as a repentant follower, but as an essential bearer of knowledge. In the works of Piero della Francesca, for example, Magdalene appears with rich symbolism that seems intentionally layered. Her robes are often painted in striking hues, deep reds and golds, colors associated with royalty, mystery, and the sacred feminine. Her posture is confident. She stands tall, illuminated, centered, unlike the secondary positioning customary in medieval religious art. These choices are not accidental. They reflect an evolving understanding of her role in Christian history and perhaps even a desire to restore a suppressed narrative. Further south, in the workshops of Italy's greatest sculptors and architects, the Magdalene appeared in ways that hinted at ancient mysteries. Some depictions present her holding a chalice, a symbol that Orthodox tradition rarely connects to her, but which speculative interpretations link to the idea of the Grail as a symbol of sacred blood. In certain cathedrals, particularly in France and Italy, statues of Magdalene appear in places of prominence, atop pillars or beside altars where one would expect to find saints of greater canonical importance. It is as though some patrons or artists were intentionally elevating her status, preserving a story the Church no longer wished to tell. Even more striking are the clues embedded in architecture. Throughout the Gothic and Renaissance periods, architects incorporated symbols like the rose, the five-pointed star, and the chalice, motifs associated with Magdalene, into stone carvings on church facades, window tracery, and chapel floors. Sometimes these symbols appear in clusters, arranged with such precision that they seem to form a code. In certain chapels dedicated to her, the geometry of the floor tiles aligns with constellations associated with feminine divinity in ancient mystery traditions. These are not random embellishments. They're choices made with intention, crafted by artisans who understood the power of geometry and symbol. In France, particularly in Provence, artists portrayed Magdalene in ways that aligned with the local belief that she lived and taught there after arriving in exile. Unlike the more somber depictions elsewhere, Provençal art shows her with radiant features, as though illuminated from within. Some paintings even feature a child near her or symbols of fertility, details that Orthodox commentators dismiss as allegorical, but which resonates strongly with the idea of lineage. A single detail may be ambiguous, but across dozens of works, a pattern begins to emerge, suggesting that something more than mere artistic preference was at play. Not all of these works survived unaltered. Historians have documented numerous paintings that were retouched, modified, or even partially destroyed during later periods when the Church sought to tighten control over doctrine. In some cases, early sketches reveal a female figure where later versions show a male apostle. In others, symbols associated with Magdalene were scraped away or painted over. These acts of revision do not prove a conspiracy, but they do indicate that someone considered these representations troubling enough to alter. Even during the Renaissance, when artistic freedom flourished, certain subjects remained dangerous. The idea of Magdalene as a teacher, a leader, or a bearer of sacred descent challenged the male-dominated structure of the Church. Artists who wished to explore these ideas had to do so subtly, embedding their messages behind layers of allegory, geometry, and symbolism. Their canvases became covert vessels of memory, preserving a version of history that could not be openly spoken. Today, as scholars and seekers revisit these works with new eyes, the hidden threads become more visible. It is not that any single painting or sculpture reveals a secret on its own, but that the accumulated patterns suggest a quiet, persistent acknowledgement of Magdalene's greater role. In this way, the Renaissance served as a bridge between ancient legends and modern curiosity, a period when art became the safe repository for truths that history refused to preserve. If the story of a sacred lineage survived the upheavals of medieval Europe, it may have done so not through documents or public declarations, but through the brushstrokes of artists who understood that some truths must be hidden in plain sight. By the time Europe entered the Age of Reason, a profound shift had begun. Old institutions were questioned, ancient dogmas reevaluated, and scholars across the continent turned their attention to philosophy, science, and the deeper structure of human thought. Yet beneath this surge of rational inquiry, an equally powerful undercurrent grew, one that quietly revisited the mysteries the Church had long suppressed. In salons, private libraries, and candlelit gatherings, thinkers whispered about old lineages, forbidden texts, and a feminine spiritual legacy said to have been buried since the earliest days of Christianity. And at the center of that whispering stood Mary Magdalene, not as a saint of penitence, but as a bearer of secret knowledge. The Enlightenment prided itself on logic and reason, but human curiosity is far more complex than pure intellect. As scholars pored over ancient manuscripts and rediscovered Gnostic writings, many were struck by the disparity between the official portrayal of Magdalene and the voice preserved in suppressed texts. In the Gospel of Mary and other apocryphal works, she emerged as a visionary, a teacher, and the disciple closest to the central figure of the faith. These writings challenged the conventional hierarchy and invited difficult questions about why her voice had been silenced. It was during this era that certain intellectual circles quietly adopted her as a symbol, not of repentance, but of hidden enlightenment. The more scholars studied early Christian history, the more they realized that countless stories have been shaped, edited, or erased to align with a patriarchal structure. This realization ignited a fascination with the possibility that Magdalene represented a lost spiritual dimension, one that the institutional church had spent centuries pushing into darkness. Freemasonry, emerging in its modern form during this period, became one of the unexpected vessels for these ideas. Though publicly the movement focused on philosophy, morality, and the symbolic architecture of human society, many lodges harbored deeper, esoteric interests. Their rituals referenced ancient wisdom traditions, combining biblical allegory with mystical symbolism. Within their teachings, the idea of a hidden truth preserved through centuries resonated strongly. Some lodges, particularly in France and Scotland, began to incorporate elements subtly honoring the feminine divine. In certain rituals, the concept of the lost word or hidden wisdom took on a tone that scholars now interpret as referencing suppressed aspects of early Christianity, especially those involving Magdalene. While not openly declared, the language of these rites often hinted at a tradition that had been intentionally overshadowed. The masculine symbols of the craft were occasionally balanced with quiet, veiled references to the sacred feminine, suggesting an awareness that an essential part of the spiritual narrative had been removed. Beyond Freemasonry, the Rosicrucians, another mystical movement gaining momentum during the Enlightenment, embraced the idea that ancient knowledge had been scattered and hidden after periods of persecution. Their manifestos spoke of a secret brotherhood guarding divine truths, awaiting the day when humanity was ready to receive them. Though they did not explicitly name Magdalene, many esoteric scholars believe that elements of their symbolism, particularly the rose, reflect a tradition tied to her lineage and teachings. The rose, after all, had long been associated with the Magdalene in regions of southern France, symbolizing secrecy, purity, and the sacred blood. In the shadow of these movements, private scholars and aristocrats began forming small circles of discussion, salons where philosophy, art, and theology mingled freely. It was here that questions not permitted in public discourse found fertile ground. Some participants openly debated whether the earliest followers of Christ had intended a more equal partnership between the masculine and feminine. Others speculated that if Magdalene had indeed carried a sacred bloodline to Europe, the truth of such a lineage would have been dangerous to reveal during earlier centuries dominated by religious authority. Genealogists of the Enlightenment, fascinated by ancient lineages, occasionally stumbled across curious gaps in medieval records, missing names, unexplained transfers of land, and marriages that seemed strategically placed yet poorly documented. While mainstream historians dismissed these anomalies as clerical errors, esoteric thinkers wondered whether they represented deliberate attempts to conceal a lineage that had continued quietly through the centuries. If certain families carried a heritage connected to Magdalene, revealing such a truth would have challenged both ecclesiastical and political power. At the same time, archaeological discoveries of the era added further fuel to these speculations. Ruins in Provence, odd inscriptions, and relics tied to early Christian communities suggested a far more complex story of how the faith took root in Europe. While academics cataloged these findings with clinical interest, mystics and esoteric scholars interpreted them through a different lens, seeing in them traces of a tradition that had, for centuries, lived on the margins of official history. Even literature reflected this shifting undercurrent. Writers began to explore themes of hidden knowledge, lost heirs, mysterious bloodlines, and powerful feminine figures whose wisdom had been erased. Some novels disguised these ideas within romantic or mythical narratives, while others used allegory to critique the Church's long-standing dominance. Though fictional on the surface, many of these works carried subtle echoes of esoteric speculation, ensuring that the questions surrounding Magdalene's role continued to circulate even as rational philosophy became the intellectual fashion. What is striking about the Enlightenment's relationship with these mysteries is the contrast between its public and private face. Publicly, Europe celebrated science, mathematics, and empirical reasoning. Privately, behind closed doors and carefully chosen company, its greatest thinkers pondered questions that were anything but scientific. The possibility of a hidden bloodline, the meaning of suppressed scriptures, and the symbolism carried through art, architecture, and ritual. All of these remained active subjects of exploration. This tension reveals something essential about human nature. Even in an age defined by reason, people are drawn to the mysteries that lie just beyond the reach of empirical proof. And perhaps the Enlightenment, with its hunger for lost knowledge and its willingness to challenge authority, was uniquely suited to rediscover fragments of the Magdalene story. It provided the intellectual tools to question official narratives, while the esoteric movements provided the symbolic framework to interpret the secrets hidden beneath them. Though the Age of Reason never openly embraced the idea of a sacred lineage, it set the stage for future generations. It reopened the door to ancient texts, reawakened interest in mystical traditions, and stirred curiosity about the parts of Christian history that had been obscured. And in doing so, it ensured that the story of Mary Magdalene, her teachings, her legacy, and the secrets possibly carried through her descendants, would not be forgotten, but would quietly wait for the world to grow curious again. As the modern era unfolded, the legacy of hidden traditions, secret lineages, and suppressed spiritual histories began to surface with greater boldness than ever before. What had once been whispered in private lodges or confined to obscure manuscripts now found its way into mainstream scholarship, literature, and cultural discourse. The world was changing rapidly, politically, socially, and technologically. And in this shifting landscape, long-forgotten narratives resurfaced with a force that surprised even the scholars who first brought them to light. The 19th century played a crucial role in this resurgence. Archaeology emerged as a scientific discipline, and explorers scoured the Middle East, North Africa, and Southern Europe in search of ancient ruins and lost manuscripts. Their discoveries did not merely confirm established historical accounts. They unveiled contradictions, gaps, and alternative interpretations that challenged the traditional story of early Christianity. As fragments of Gnostic texts and early liturgical writings were uncovered, they painted a picture of a far more diverse spiritual landscape, one in which Mary Magdalene held a prominence entirely incompatible with the penitential figure later constructed by church authority. This era also saw a renewed fascination with symbolism, mythology, and the esoteric. Romanticism, with its embrace of emotion, intuition, and the mystical, provided fertile ground for reinterpreting ancient legends. Artists, poets, and philosophers were drawn to the idea of the divine feminine, seeing in Magdalene not merely a biblical figure, but a symbol of suppressed wisdom and spiritual transformation. Her image began appearing in paintings that depicted her not as a weeping penitent, but as a contemplative figure holding a book, a skull, or a flame, symbols of knowledge, mortality, and illumination. Meanwhile, in France, particular attention turned toward the regions of Provence and Languedoc. Local traditions long held that Magdalene had lived and taught there after leaving the Holy Land. These stories gained renewed interest as scholars began documenting the legends with academic seriousness. Pilgrims flocked to the grotto of Saint Baume, believing it to be the cave where she spent her final years in prayer. Though dismissed by some as folklore, the endurance of these traditions raised a compelling question. Why had this particular story survived for so many centuries if it had no roots in history? The discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in the mid-20th century transformed speculation into genuine scholarly debate. For the first time, The voice of Magdalene in ancient texts could be studied in her own context. She appeared as a confidant, a visionary, and a teacher entrusted with teachings others did not understand. Her presence was not peripheral, it was central. These texts revealed early Christian communities that valued her insight and recognized her leadership. Yet history had obscured this role so thoroughly that the world was startled by the clarity with which her significance emerged. As these revelations seeped into public consciousness, they ignited broader cultural questions. If such an important figure had been deliberately diminished, what else had been hidden? What other stories had been rewritten? And why? Academics, theologians, and independent researchers engaged in spirited debate, often reaching conflicting conclusions, but the overall effect was unmistakable. The narrative surrounding Magdalene was changing. The 20th century also saw the rise of alternative spiritual movements that openly embraced the concept of the divine feminine. These groups, whether rooted in mystical Christianity, neo-Gnostic thought, or entirely new traditions, saw Magdalene as a bridge between ancient wisdom and modern spiritual yearning. To them, she represented a form of spirituality grounded in compassion, inner knowledge, and experiential understanding rather than rigid doctrine. Her story appealed to those seeking a path that honored both intuition and intellect, both tradition and transformation. At the same time, a growing number of historians and genealogists revisited medieval European records with renewed focus. The centuries-old speculation of a hidden bloodline resurfaced, not as a fringe theory, but as a subject of genuine academic curiosity. While evidence remained elusive, the persistence of certain family names, unexplained transfers of property, and peculiar patterns in noble genealogies sparked interest. The possibility of an unbroken lineage reaching back to antiquity raised profound theological and political implications. Even if never conclusively proven, the very act of exploring such a possibility demonstrated how deeply Magdalene's legacy had re-entered the collective imagination. In literature, the modern era transformed Magdalene from a marginal figure into a central heroine. Novels, academic works, films, and documentaries portrayed her not merely as a misunderstood disciple, but as a woman whose voice had been systematically suppressed. Some interpretations were grounded in careful research, others in imaginative speculation, but all contributed to a cultural shift that placed her at the heart of a broader reevaluation of spiritual history. She became a symbol of truth rediscovered, agency reclaimed, and narratives rewritten. In the world of feminist theology, Magdalene emerged as a foundational figure. Scholars argued that her erasure reflected broader patterns of marginalizing women's voices throughout history. Restoring her rightful place was not merely an act of historical correction, but a reclamation of spiritual balance. Through her, they reconstructed a vision of early Christianity where partnership, equality, and shared spiritual authority were the norm rather than the exception. As the 21st century dawned, technology accelerated this reawakening. Information that had once been confined to academic journals now circulated widely online. New generations encountered Magdalene not through the lens of penitence, but through a multiplicity of perspectives: historical, spiritual, symbolic, and scholarly. Her story evolved from a footnote into a lens through which people questioned the structure of religious authority, the shaping of historical narratives, and the ways in which power determines whose voices are remembered. Today, Magdalene stands as one of the most compelling figures in the intersection of history, faith, and cultural memory. The modern era has not solved every mystery surrounding her life, her teachings, or her potential descendants, but it has restored her to a place of profound significance. She embodies a bridge between the known and the hidden, the recorded and the forgotten, the faith that was preserved and the wisdom that was lost. Her legacy, once suppressed, now inspires not only spiritual seekers, but historians, artists, scholars, and individuals searching for meaning beyond the confines of traditional narratives. In reclaiming her story, the modern world has opened the door to a deeper understanding of its own past, and to the possibility that the truths buried for centuries were never truly lost, only waiting for the right moment to reemerge. As the threads of Magdalene's story wove themselves into modern scholarship and cultural imagination, a new and startling chapter began to take shape, one defined not by ancient manuscripts or forgotten rituals, but by curious discoveries scattered across European landscapes. These were not mere legends whispered by villagers or vague memories preserved in folk tradition. They were physical, tangible markers, inscriptions, symbols, architectural anomalies, and carved emblems that seemed to speak in a quiet but persistent voice across the centuries. They did not shout their secrets. They hinted, they suggested, and they invited interpretation. Many of these clues emerged in places already associated with Magdalene: the Languedoc region, the Pyrenees, the Provençal hills, and the medieval sanctuaries that had puzzled historians for centuries. Yet when viewed through the growing lens of esoteric scholarship, these places took on an entirely new significance. Something hidden lay beneath their stones, encoded in their orientation, their iconography, and their myths. And for those willing to look closely, the landscape itself seemed to form a map, one that pointed not toward material treasure, but toward an ancient truth long guarded by secretive families and forgotten orders. In the village of Rennes-le-Château, a story that had simmered quietly for generations burst into global attention. The mysterious wealth of its 19th-century priest, Berenger Saunière, sparked widespread speculation. Some believed he had discovered a hidden document or relic. Others suspected he had unearthed evidence concerning a royal bloodline. Among murals, inscriptions, and architectural oddities inside the small church, researchers identified symbols commonly associated with the divine feminine, alchemical transformation, and hidden lineage. One detail stood out more than most: the peculiar placement of a statue of Mary Magdalene at the base of the altar. Her posture, contemplative, watchful, almost protective, contrasts sharply with standard iconography. The message seemed deliberate, as if the priest himself were guarding a secret rather than simply decorating his parish church. When combined with strange references in his personal diaries and unexplained financial transactions, Rennes-le-Château became the center of a mystery that refused to be dismissed as coincidence. Nearby, the landscape formed geometric alignments that fascinated researchers. Hilltops, chapels, menhirs, and ancient burial sites appeared to fit into pentagonal and star-shaped patterns visible only through aerial photography and cartographic analysis. To some, these alignments suggested an ancient sacred geometry preserved across generations. To others, they pointed toward a pathway or code intentionally embedded in the terrain, a map left behind by those who sought to preserve Magdalene's legacy through symbolism rather than words. But the clues were not limited to France. Across Europe, unexpected artifacts gained new interpretations in light of the Magdalene mysteries. In northern Spain, medieval churches displayed frescoes in which Magdalene appeared beside figures normally reserved for royal authority: kings, queens, and heraldic protectors. Her clothing in these artworks resembled not the simple garments of a biblical follower, but the noble attire of a woman of status. These images, often located in regions associated with ancient Jewish communities and early Christian migrations, suggested that her story was interwoven with local histories more deeply than previously thought. In Italy, a crypt discovered beneath an old monastic site revealed inscriptions referencing a holy woman traveling from Judea, whose teachings spread among Mediterranean families. Though not identified by name, the description matched the long-held Provençal tradition. More surprising were the genealogical hints accompanying the inscriptions, references to a family line entrusted to protect sacred knowledge. Farther north, in Scotland, the Sinclair family, long associated with Templar lore, became another focal point. Carvings in Rosslyn Chapel, famous for its mysterious motifs, included imagery that some interpreted as depicting strange plants native to the Middle East, symbolic representations of hidden teachings, and female figures holding chalice-like objects reminiscent of Grail symbolism. Though highly contested, the theory that Rosslyn contained encoded knowledge relating to a sacred lineage grew increasingly popular as more researchers connected the chapel's iconography with Magdalene's story. Even in England, a curious thread emerged. Several medieval manuscripts referenced a bride of Christ, a term interpreted metaphorically in ecclesiastical teaching. Yet some scholars argue that these references were intentionally ambiguous, concealing hidden layers of meaning. In certain texts preserved by monastic orders, allegorical descriptions of the beloved companion bore striking resemblance to non-canonical accounts of Magdalene. The language seemed carefully chosen, as if the scribes were recording a truth they could not openly express. As these discoveries accumulated, the idea took root that Europe itself was a vast archive, holding pieces of a story too dangerous to record plainly. Secret societies, family orders, and monastic groups may have acted as silent custodians, transmitting knowledge through architecture, art, and coded writings. Rather than a single hidden document or buried relic, the truth appeared to be fragmented, scattered intentionally like a mosaic meant to be assembled only when humanity was ready to understand it. One of the most enigmatic pieces of this mosaic was found in an obscure French manuscript describing a forgotten sect known as the Companions of the Ark. They believed, according to the text, that the sacred lineage was hidden in plain sight, and that its protection was ensured not through secrecy, but through misdirection, by weaving truth into allegory and allowing myth to act as a shield. They held that the lineage would reveal itself only in an age when people sought spiritual wisdom over institutional control. This notion dovetailed with the resurgence of interest in Magdalene in the modern world. As society moved beyond rigid dogmas, the symbols and messages embedded in Europe's landscape seemed to resonate more clearly. The sacred feminine, long dismissed or concealed, reemerged not merely as a theological concept, but as a historical force. People began to see the possibility that the real treasure of the Magdalene tradition was not gold, artifacts, or royal titles, but knowledge, a different understanding of spiritual heritage that had been quietly sustained across generations. The more these clues were studied, the more they suggested deliberate preservation rather than coincidence. Each symbol, inscription, and architectural anomaly seemed to point toward the same conclusion. A truth had been protected, not erased. It was safeguarded by those who understood that certain knowledge, if revealed prematurely, could disrupt established structures of authority. And so they hid it in stone, in art, in geometry, and in legend, knowing future generations might someday decipher what had been encoded. Across Europe, what once seemed like scattered mysteries began aligning like stars in a forgotten constellation, illuminating a path that led back to the same central figure. The deeper researchers delved, the more likely it seemed that the landscape itself whispered her name, not in explicit declarations, but in the quiet, persistent language of symbols that had endured through centuries of silence. If the clues scattered across Europe formed a mosaic of symbols and forgotten whispers, then the modern theories emerging today are the attempts to interpret that mosaic, to give shape to the image hidden beneath centuries of dust, denial, and deliberate obfuscation. These theories do not exist in isolation. They arise from patterns noticed across archaeology, comparative myth, sacred geometry, genealogical analysis, and the study of suppressed texts. As researchers, historians, mystics and independent scholars examine this intricate web. They propose explanations that range from the cautious and scholarly to the bold and revolutionary. And surprisingly, many of these theories converge on the same provocative question. What if Mary Magdalene's role was far greater than history has allowed? And what if her legacy did not end with her death, but lived on through a hidden lineage that quietly shaped the destiny of Europe? One of the strongest modern theories focuses on the possibility of a bloodline, sometimes referred to as the sacred lineage or Grail bloodline. This idea suggests that Magdalene and Jesus may have shared a partnership far deeper than teacher and follower. Not simply a spiritual bond, but a familial one: marriage, children, and descendants who carried both their heritage and their teachings forward. While mainstream historians resist such interpretations, theorists point out that ancient Jewish custom made marriage the norm, especially for rabbis, spiritual leaders, and men entrusted with continuing a lineage. They argue that Jesus being unmarried would have been the exception, not the rule. The silence of canonical sources regarding any marriage may not be evidence of absence, but proof of intentional redaction by later authorities who sought to reshape the narrative to fit doctrinal agendas. If a bloodline existed, the next question becomes, where did it go? Here, modern theorists weave historical data with legend. The long-standing Provençal tradition that Magdalene arrived in southern France gains new significance. According to these theories, she would not have traveled alone, but with companions entrusted to protect her children. This possibility aligns with the sudden rise of certain noble families in Gaul during the early medieval period. Families whose genealogies appear to begin abruptly, without clear Roman or Germanic origins. Theories suggest that these families may have been the silent guardians or direct descendants of the sacred lineage, gradually integrating into the aristocracy as Christianity spread across Europe. Another modern line of thought connects the bloodline to the Merovingians, the early kings of France. These rulers were known for their mysterious symbols, long hair worn as a sacred emblem, and a reputation for possessing supernatural wisdom. Medieval chroniclers hinted at their otherworldly origins and divine legitimacy. When viewed through the lens of alternative history, some theorists propose that the Merovingians did not merely claim descent from ancient heroes, but from a holy family whose identity had to be concealed to avoid persecution by the rising church hierarchy. Though controversial, the theory continues to attract interest because of the strange gaps and symbolic oddities surrounding Merovingian lore, elements that seem to belong to a deeper tradition rather than mere political mythology. Yet not all theories focus on royal families. Some propose a more decentralized lineage, one scattered intentionally to avoid detection. According to this idea, the descendants of Magdalene's line never sought crowns or earthly power. Instead, they lived quietly among the people, marrying into various regional families, expanding across Europe in subtle and untraceable ways. Their significance was spiritual, not political. They preserved teachings, maintained oral traditions, and passed down rituals associated with divine wisdom and sacred union. This view aligns with secret groups like the Cathars, who venerated a female spiritual figure, and the Bogomils, whose beliefs echo Gnostic traditions possibly connected to Magdalene's teachings. A different branch of modern theory focuses not solely on lineage, but on knowledge, what some call the Magdalene Code. According to this perspective, Magdalene carried esoteric teachings that differed from the institutionalized doctrines of later Christianity. These teachings emphasized inner transformation, the balance of masculine and feminine energies, and direct spiritual experience rather than authority mediated through clergy. The idea suggests that a teacher of such powerful and egalitarian wisdom would have posed a threat to emerging structures of religious control. Thus, suppression of her role was not merely about morality or reputation. It was about eliminating an alternative path to spiritual enlightenment. Her story, therefore, becomes a symbol of a larger conflict between institutional power and personal revelation. Some theorists propose that her code was preserved through symbols rather than words. Sacred geometry, mandalas, the Vesica Piscis, and the rose all appear in medieval European art with surprising frequency. These symbols often coincide with architectural layouts of Gothic cathedrals, whose builders possessed extraordinary mathematical knowledge. Some suggest that these symbols encode principles of balance, creation, and the feminine divine, concepts central to Gnostic interpretations of Magdalene. The cathedrals themselves may have been monumental books of stone, preserving truths that could not be openly written or spoken. Another modern theory examines psychological and cultural patterns. According to this angle, the resurgence of interest in Magdalene in the last century is not accidental, but reflects a collective awakening. As global societies shift away from rigid hierarchies and toward more egalitarian values, the figure of Magdalene naturally rises from obscurity. She embodies compassion, wisdom, partnership, and inner transformation, all qualities increasingly valued in modern culture. Scholars of myth and archetype suggest that her reappearance in literature, film, and religious dialogue mirrors a deep human desire to restore balance between masculine and feminine energies long divided by patriarchal systems. More radical theorists even propose that the return of Magdalene is the prophesied return of the sacred feminine itself, a symbolic shift rather than a literal one. They argue that ancient prophecies referencing a return of divine wisdom refer not to a physical person, but to the rediscovery of teachings once suppressed. In this interpretation, Magdalene's legacy is cyclical. It emerges in times of great transformation, offering guidance when humanity is ready to hear it. And yet, amid all these theories, bloodlines, hidden teachings, symbolic architecture, archetypal revival, one theme persists: the profound possibility that the historical narrative taught for centuries has been incomplete. Whether through deliberate suppression, political necessity, or simple misunderstanding, a vital thread of early Christian history was severed. Theories today seek to reattach this thread, to reweave it into the tapestry of the past in a way that honors both historical evidence and spiritual resonance. Ultimately, modern theorists do not claim certainty. They offer possibilities, pathways through the forest of forgotten history. Some of their ideas may one day be proven false. Others may gain validation through future discoveries. But what makes these theories compelling is not their finality, but their invitation. They invite us to reconsider what we think we know. They invite us to explore history not as a fixed story, but as a living, breathing mystery still unfolding. In that sense, the modern theories are less about rewriting the past and more about reclaiming it, recovering voices, restoring balance, and reawakening a story that may never truly have been lost, only waiting for the world to be ready to hear it. As the long journey through ancient texts, hidden symbols, and evolving theories reaches its final stretch, a quiet realization begins to emerge, one that does not demand certainty, nor rely on definitive proof, but grows from the very patterns that have persisted across centuries. The story of Mary Magdalene, once reduced to a footnote in canonical history, now stands illuminated by the combined light of scholarship, myth, archaeology, and collective intuition. Yet even after all the discoveries, debates, and revelations, an undeniable truth remains. Her legacy is not contained within any single artifact, manuscript, or lineage. Instead, it stretches across time like a shadow cast by something far greater, something living, something that continues to breathe within cultures, rituals, and human longing. In the silence of this final reflection, the pieces of a narrative begin to settle into place. What emerges is not a solved mystery, but a profound sense of coherence. it becomes clear that the enduring fascination with Mary Magdalene is not merely about historical correction or alternative theories, nor even about the tantalizing possibility of a hidden bloodline. It is about something deeper, something that touches the structure of the human soul and the shape of civilization itself. For many, Magdalene represents the restoration of a balance lost long ago. Her presence signals a reconciliation between opposites: faith and reason, institution and intuition, masculine and feminine. The modern world, fractured by divisions and defined by rigid hierarchies, finds in her story a gentle but radical suggestion that the earliest roots of Western spirituality were more harmonious, inclusive, and holistic than later narratives allowed. This idea, even without historical certainty, carries immense power. It invites individuals and societies alike to rethink the boundaries they have inherited. The figure of Magdalene challenges the assumption that wisdom flows only through official channels, that spiritual authority is confined to institutions, and that history belongs solely to the victors who recorded it. She symbolizes the voices that were lost, the teachings that were buried, and the possibilities that were overshadowed by the establishment of orthodoxy. Her reemergence today hints at a broader reevaluation of history, one in which hidden contributions, marginalized figures, and forgotten traditions are given space to speak once more. And so we return to the central question: did a hidden bloodline truly survive across centuries, shaping European history from the shadows? The answer, after all the evidence and speculation, remains elusive by design. Perhaps the truth is deliberately veiled, woven into symbols and stories meant to be interpreted rather than proven. Perhaps the lineage did survive, moving silently through generations of families who protected their heritage with utmost discretion. Or perhaps the bloodline is a metaphor, a poetic way of describing the transmission of esoteric knowledge and spiritual authority that transcends biological descent. What is undeniable, however, is the persistent belief in such a lineage. Across cultures and time periods, from medieval France to modern Europe, whispers of a sacred descent refused to fade. They resurfaced again and again in legends of black Madonnas, in heraldic emblems, in knightly traditions, and in remote villages that claimed to have hosted the Magdalene and her companions. The endurance of these stories suggests that whether literal or symbolic, something was being preserved, something that mattered deeply to those who came before. In this way, the royal secret of Europe may not be a single revelation, but a network of interconnected truths. It may lie in the spiritual teachings embedded in Gnostic scriptures, in the sacred geometry encoded into cathedrals, in the political histories of dynasties whose origins remain mysterious, or in the mythic archetype that Magdalene embodies. The reality could be a synthesis of all these elements, a truth that spans both the physical and the metaphysical, the historical and the symbolic. What makes this possibility so compelling is that it mirrors the very structure of ancient wisdom traditions, which often express truth through metaphor, allegory, and layered meaning. They understood that the deepest truths cannot be imposed. They must be discovered by those who are ready to understand them. Perhaps this is why Magdalene's story survived, not in official histories, but in quiet legends, encoded symbols, and grassroots devotion. The knowledge was not lost, it was protected. As we look toward the future, the resurgence of Magdalene's story raises an intriguing question. Why now? Why is the modern world suddenly ready to reconsider her role, explore hidden histories, and challenge long-standing dogmas? The answer may lie in the shifting consciousness of humanity. In an age of information, uncertainty, and global transformation, people seek narratives that resonate with authenticity, balance, and depth. Magdalene's story offers all three. It speaks to those who feel the limitations of rigid structures and yearn for a spirituality rooted in compassion, partnership, and inner wisdom. Her narrative also invites us to consider the fragility of historical memory. What we accept as truth may only be the version that survived political and cultural upheaval. The restoration of lost voices is essential not merely for academic accuracy, but for collective healing. By revisiting forgotten histories, we allow space for a more inclusive understanding of the past, one that embraces complexity, nuance, and the possibility that truth may not reside in a single interpretation. In this sense, the final revelation is not a dramatic unveiling of a hidden relic or a definitive genealogy. It is a realization that the legacy of Mary Magdalene lives precisely because it cannot be confined. It adapts, evolves, and reveals new layers as each generation approaches it with fresh eyes. She exists simultaneously as a historical figure, a spiritual archetype, a symbol of suppressed wisdom, and a catalyst for rediscovery.